see. Hello, everyone. It's a joy to be with you on this Labor Day, on Monday, Labor Day in 2020. I'm joined by museum docent and NMCWM volunteer Brad Stone, and he's going to be talking with us today about the contributions of Jewish Americans in the Civil War in what promises to be an exciting presentation. I know I'm looking forward to it. It's, like I said, wonderful to be with you all today. Go ahead and put in the comments where you're watching from. It's always fun to check in where people are tuning in from. We have people all over the country and indeed all over the world who tune in for these videos. So that's always, I know personally, fun for me to see wherever people are watching from. If you enjoy this video at any point, it would really help us a lot if you gave the video a like. If you like it, or maybe if you love it, you can give the video a heart or a love. We appreciate that. And every time you do that, it increases the likelihood that other people might see it. So that helps us so much. And what helps even in addition to that is if you share the video. There should be a little button there that says share. So if you do that, that also will help us immensely. Again, increases the likelihood that people will see it. I see we already have 31 people joining us today, which is really exciting. So thanks for tuning in. And hopefully we can get even more people to tune in with us. Let's see, I see we got people commenting already. Colleen from New Jersey, Crystal from Virginia, Cynthia from Fort Pierce, Florida, Jay from Lakewood, California, Wendy from Rockville, Maryland. I know Wendy is one of our members at the museum, which brings me to my next point. If you enjoy these videos, one of the best way to support the museum is to become a member. And I'm going to be dropping a link in the comments to how you can either become a member or donate. And all of that support goes directly into producing programming like this. So if you can, it really helps us immensely if you do. And thank you so much to those of you who have done so this year and every year in the past. More great comments. John McFarland from Lakeland, Florida. Eddie McDevitt, something new, looking forward to learning from Brad. Kevin tuning in from Gulfport, Mississippi, and on and on and on. We have some really excited folks tuning in. We're already up to 37 and climbing. Again, it's wonderful to be with you. If you're just joining us, my name is John Lustrea. I'm the Education Coordinator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And I'm joined today by one of our volunteers extraordinaire, Brad Stone. And he's going to be talking to us today about Jewish Americans in the Civil War. So with all of that said, I'm going to turn it over to Brad.
Well, thank you, John. That was very kind of you. And I never knew I had so many relatives. But for all those of you who are joining us, thank you very much. I hope I live up to the expectations. John, are my slides up on the screen now?
No, not at present. So if you got the Zoom window up, you go down and hit share screen.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And I know, viewers, this is the exciting content that you've been waiting for.
Let's see. Hold on one second. I'm sorry. Hold on. Here we go. A little technical difficulty, but it should be up now. Is it up?
Yes, fantastic.
Okay, great.
And just before you start, Brad, got some more great comments. Carolyn tuning in from Colorado, saying that two of her two-times great-grandfathers were Jewish soldiers in the Civil War. So I imagine there's probably a number of people tuning in with Jewish ancestors who served in the Civil War. So I know there's a number of people that are kind of personally connected to this story. So should be a good one. Take us away, Brad.
Okay, well, thank you. As you may see on your screen there, I have two people that were very instrumental in the war in different ways. The one on the right is Uriah Levy, who is a Commodore in the United States Navy, and we'll talk a little bit about him. The other person, of course, is Ulysses S. Grant. If at any point you can't stand this presentation, you decide to bail out, the only thing I ask you not to do is to say, I heard this terrible talk about Jews in the Civil War, but I did learn one thing: Ulysses S. Grant was Jewish. He was not. But I have him there for a reason, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as the presentation goes on. There are a lot of books about Jews in the Civil War, some excellent works. My presentation is going to kind of focus in on one aspect of what's happening to the Jewish community in the Civil War that will have a profound effect on that community. And indeed, it's sort of something that's happening to America as a whole during that period. And it has to do with demographic changes that are going to profoundly influence the course of events during and after the Civil War. So my presentation is going to be a little bit different than many that also address this subject. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about what my understanding of the Civil War was and Jews in the Civil War before I started really researching the topic. And much of that came from my Sunday school, experience. They kind of briefly brushed over Jewish history preceding the 20th century. And when it came to the Civil War, this is what the narrative was. It was basically, there were Jews during the Civil War. The vast majority of them fought for the North. Jews, by and large, were opposed to slavery because, of course, of the experience of Jews in bondage and slavery. And, there was one prominent Confederate Jew, a guy by the name of Judah Benjamin, but he was a good guy because he was very bright, and he was also for the emancipation of slaves. So that narrative, the more I looked into it, parts of it are correct, parts of it are not. The story of Jews in the Civil War is far more complex and I would say interesting than that. So let's begin and one of the fundamental things needed to do to understand that history, in my opinion, is to look at the Jewish groups in this country at the time of the Civil War. And there are lots of different types of Jews. There are lots of ways that Jews differ in terms of, today they're Reform and Orthodox and Conservative. But looking at the period of the Civil War, one of the things to look at are there are basically two groups of Jews in the country leading up to the Civil War. And there are profound differences between those two, both in terms of when they come to this country and I would say why they're coming to this country. So the first group listed here are the Sephardic Jews. Now, Sephardic Jews are Jews that came from Spain and Portugal. Why are they coming? Well, they're coming in the 1600s and 1700s largely to flee from religious persecution. There are inquisitions going on in both of those countries, and Jews are basically told you have to convert to Christianity or horrible things are going to happen to you. You might be put to death. You might be tortured. You might be banished. So a lot of Jews leave those countries and head to the New World. Some settle in South America. Many settle in the Caribbean. A lot settle in North America, and they are seeking religious freedom. The other group that we're talking about at the time of the Civil War are Ashkenazi Jews. They are coming from more northern parts of Europe. They're coming from what we would consider today Germany, Central and Eastern Europe. Particularly at the time we're talking about, they're mainly coming from Germany and Central Europe. They're coming from the 1700s, and their immigration really picks up into the 1800s. So they're coming for somewhat different reasons, I would argue. So it's going to be the relationship between these two groups and their relative influence in the United States going into the Civil War that, again, will have a profound impact not only on the Jewish community, but I would argue the war and post-war America. So let's get to the next slide. So when you look at the Jewish influence in America, particularly in the early history of the country, it's primarily the Sephardic Jews that are most influential. And indeed, the first three main players in the Civil War that I'm going to talk about are all Sephardic Jews. Now, the first one is Uriah Levy, who's a Commodore in the United States Navy. I did a video presentation on him back around the Passover season. So if you're interested in more information about the guy, he's a very colorful individual. I recommend you see the video. But just a little highlight of his life. His family flees from Portugal, makes their way into the United States. He's born in 1792 to a fairly prosperous Philadelphia merchant family, but he wants to have a career at sea. He runs away at age 10 to become a cabin boy. He joins the Navy during the War of 1812, becomes a hero. In the decades that follow, he works his way up the ranks, despite facing some severe anti-Semitism. And miraculously, by 1859, he becomes a Commodore in the United States Navy. That's extraordinary. There are only a handful of men that reach that rank. And of course, he's the first Jew to ever reach that rank in the Navy. The other thing to know about him is because his family was motivated to come to this country because of fear of religious persecution, he is profoundly grateful to this nation, and particularly Thomas Jefferson, who he sees as a leader in the movement for religious tolerance. And that leads him to do a couple of noteworthy things. He commissions the statue of Jefferson that today sits in the US Capitol building. That remains today the only privately financed statue in the Capitol. The other thing he does is he rescues Thomas Jefferson's home, Monticello, from the wrecking ball in the 1830s. By that time, the Monticello had fallen into serious disrepair. It was going to be destroyed. Levy buys the property and restores it fully to its greatness. And he's in large part who we have to thank for having him around today. But the reason I focus in on him is when the war breaks out, he is the senior ranking Jewish official in not only the United States Navy, but in the entire Union government. So he's a very important symbol at the outset of the war. Now, he will die in 1862, March of 1862. But a lot of the reforms he puts into place during his career in the Navy will serve the Union Navy very well throughout the war. So let's look at the Confederate side. Why is Levy the senior most official in the Union government? It's because two other senior ranking Jews who had been in the US government before the Civil War leave to join the Confederacy. One is this guy, David Levy Yulee. Ironically, his name had been David Levy, no relation to the Commodore, but he changed it later in life to Yulee. He comes from a Sephardic family who comes to the US in the 1820s. He will become a very prosperous sugar plantation owner, and he becomes very active in building railroads throughout Florida. In 1845, he becomes a senator for Florida, and he's known as a very staunch supporter of slavery, so much so that he's labeled the Florida Fire Eater for his fiery defenses of the institution of slavery. Before the war breaks out, he advises Confederate officials of the states that have already seceded that it would be a good idea to seize the federal forts in Florida. That will later give rise to charges that he, in effect, conducted treason against this country while he was still a US senator. At the war's outset, he will leave the Senate and join the Confederacy. Now, the other US senator who's Jewish is Uriah Levy, and I mentioned him before. He is, again, another sugar plantation owner. He does own enslaved people. He is a very staunch supporter of the institution of slavery. He will actively join the Confederacy in a number of very important functions once the war begins. He is, Jefferson Davis's right-hand man. He starts out as a Confederate Attorney General, then he moves up to the Secretary of War. Eventually, he'll become the Secretary of State for the Confederacy, which makes him the third-ranking official, highest-ranking official in the Confederacy. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about Uriah Levy, Judah Benjamin, to dispel some of the myths of that narrative I gave you before. Sort of the embodiment of those myths are pictured in this illustration here, which was done in the 1940s, a 1940s biography of Judah Benjamin. And it shows him symbolically holding back the whip of a cruel slave owner from beating a poor, enslaved person. That's totally a myth. As I mentioned before, Judah Benjamin owned slaves. He was a staunch supporter of the institution. And the idea that he was for the, emancipation of slaves is pretty much false. He opposed it throughout his work in the Confederate government until toward the very end of the war, and he only relented because he thought it might be a way of getting some European support for the Confederacy. But he was by no means a supporter of emancipation. Other things, he was head of the Confederate Secret Service. He was involved in helping or organizing terrorist attacks against New York City. Some thought he might have played a role in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And after the war, he escapes the US and he lives the rest of his life in England. So in looking at the question of slavery, the question is, what were Jewish attitudes towards slavery? Were they really, as I said in the narrative, the Jews were largely against slavery? That certainly wasn't the case in the South. Jews were pretty much like their other contemporaries in the South at the time leading up to the Civil War. Most Jews didn't own slaves themselves, but quite a few did. And some Jews even were involved in the slave trade, some pretty prominent ones. So by and large, although there were some exceptions, even if Jews didn't own slaves, they were okay with the, institution of slavery. And when the war broke up, most Southern Jews supported the idea of secession. So let's look at the Northern Jews. Now, again, surely you would think that they would be against slavery, but no, again, they're very much like their contemporaries, non-Jewish contemporaries in the North. When South Carolina secedes from the Union, then President Buchanan asked for a day of prayer in January of 1861. And Rabbi Morris Raphael of a very prominent synagogue in New York gets up and he gives a prayer. And it's a very, very staunch defense of the institution of slavery. He says slavery's in the Bible, it's sanctioned by the Bible. So not only is slavery okay, but it is against religious teaching. It's positively immoral to oppose it and to be an abolitionist. Now, needless to say, this is becomes a very popular sermon throughout the Confederate States leading up to the Civil War. Here they have a biblical sanction to, support their institution, and kind of a tacit approval for them to secede from any government that would try to eliminate that biblical right. But on the other hand, there are Jewish leaders who are deeply offended by his sermon and are staunchly pro-abolitionist. One of them is Rabbi David Einhorn, who leads a congregation in Baltimore. And he gives a very strong attack against Rabbi Rapal and anyone that would defend slavery. He said for any Jew to be in favor of slavery would make them one of the worst hypocrites of all time. Now, Rabbi Einhorn does this sermon under great personal risk because, again, he's in Baltimore, which is a city that in many cases is very strongly pro-Confederate. He has to leave the city with his family under threats to his family and relocate to Philadelphia. But David Einhorn represents a big change that's coming in America and the Jewish community. He's immigrated from Germany, and he represents a whole new wave of Ashkenazi Jews that are coming into the country. And they're going to make a profound difference in Northern attitudes, in particular, toward the institution of slavery. So in the 1840s, or in 1840, there are approximately 15,000 Jews in this country. In the 20 years following it and leading up to the Civil War, that number swells to 150,000 Jews. And what's making the big difference in that surge is a dramatic wave of immigration of Ashkenazi Jews from areas that we would now consider Germany, Austria-Hungary, and other Central European areas. And a large number of these Jews are coming over because they're members of what was known as the 48 movement or 48er movement. These are people, Jews and non-Jews, who in 1848 attempted revolutions in the areas I just talked about to institute democratic governments like the United States. In almost all cases, these attempted revolutions failed. So these people came to the United States, and they're coming with a belief that they want to get the freedoms that they've always thought were synonymous with the United States, with the Bill of Rights, and that's why they're coming to this country. So it's somewhat different from the Sephardic Jews. They're coming just for religious freedom. These new Ashkenazi Jews, these 48ers, and their non-Jewish counterparts, 48ers from Germany and these other places, have a far broader definition of freedom. It extends beyond religious freedom. It embodies more universal freedom of the type that we consider today. So their attitudes towards things like slavery are going to be profoundly different. They cannot reconcile slavery with the type of freedom they're hoping to live in. So the one thing that does unite Northern Jews leading up to the Civil War, regardless of their position on slavery, is that the vast majority of Northern Jews believe that secession should not be allowed to happen, and that if the South attempts it, they should be stopped. And again, as I mentioned, the South, regardless of whether someone owned slaves or not, Jews in the South believed that the South had a right to secede. So when the war breaks out, Northern Jews and Southern Jews sign up for their respective armies, and they do so in significant numbers. It's estimated that about 7,000 to 8,000 Jews serve either in the Union Army or Navy. And in the South, it's about, proportional number. About 3,000 Jews fight for the Confederacy. to focus in on the Confederate soldiers, they do fight, you know, in every theater of the war. If you go down south, you will see a number of cemeteries that are dedicated to the memory of the Jewish fallen. One of the most famous and renowned is the historic Shockoe Hill Cemetery in Richmond. It has a very elaborate iron fence around it with swords, and you'll see in that sanctuary or in that area a large number of Jewish graves. There are similar cemeteries in places like Texas and Louisiana. There are no flag officers that ever are appointed in the Confederate forces, but you know, Jews are represented both in terms of enlisted people and in officer ranks. Now, for those of you who are, you know, Big Bang Theory, you know, fans, I'm going to sort of segue into a little segment just to show the influence that, you know, Jews did have in the Confederate government in this segment called Interdenominational Fun with Flags. And I show 3 flags here. Now, when the Confederacy seceded from the Union, one of the things you got to do if you're a sovereign country is to show that, you know, you have your own flag. So how do you do this? Well, you basically establish a committee, which is what they did. And the chairman of the committee was a guy by the name of William Porcher Miles from South Carolina. And he thought that a swell idea would be to basically adopt the Confederate flag that South Carolina had developed, which is the one on the upper left. And he said, okay, we'll get rid of the crescent, we'll get rid of the palm tree, but we'll have this flag that's designed with the cross of St. George on it, and it'll have a star for every state in the Confederacy, and I think that's swell. Well, other people said, no, we want to go with something that kind of ties in the heritage that we have with the original United States. So they went for the flag in the middle, which kind of looks more like the American flag. So there was a big debate between the two sides. Those who favored sort of the Porcher approach of a more distinct flag had a split within them. One of the Jewish delegates said, you know, I like your flag, but my problem is with the cross. To me, it could, you know, lead people to think that this was for a Christian cause. I think we ought to be more open. And so Porcher, to win this Jewish delegate's vote, said, okay, let's come up with a different design. Instead of the cross of St. George, let's do a cross of St. Andrews. So they came up with the flag at the lower right, which looks familiar to all of us. Now, ultimately, the commission decided they're going to go with the middle flag as the national flag of the Confederacy. As all you Civil War buffs know, after the Battle of Bull Run, they decided they needed a separate and distinct battle flag because that flag in the middle caused a lot of confusion among Confederate commanders. Very often in the fog of war, that when they saw that flag, they thought it might be a Union flag. So after the Battle of Bull Run, the Confederacy decided they needed a battle flag, and the battle flag they came up with is that crossed one, which is all familiar to us now. So what I tell people is, I think that, you know, many people who are reenactors or whatever who carry, you know, the Confederate battle flag do so out of heritage, not hate. But if you ever see someone from a white supremacist or you know, neo-Nazi group carrying the Confederate flag, you may want to tell them, hey, by the way, that was influenced by Jews. So anyway, let's talk about Jews on the Union side. Jews serve alongside with their, you know, non-Jewish compatriots, both in the Union Army and the Navy. And what's interesting is that most Jews tend to sign up with largely German American regiments. It kind of makes sense. Most of them have come from Germany. A lot of Jews, Ashkenazi Jews who are recent immigrants to this country, speak German, and they feel very comfortable in those units, and they feel comfortable with them. Some of the more prominent ones are the Perkins Rifles of Syracuse, New York. You see their lovely banner on the left there that was made by the Women's Lady Syracuse auxiliary of that unit. And then another famous unit was the 82nd Regiment of Illinois volunteers. Ultimately, that unit will come under the command of Jewish Colonel and later Brevet Brigadier General Edward S. Solomon, and would perform very valiantly at the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, just to show you the appreciation for the Jewish contribution made in the Union Army, a substantial number of Jews received the Congressional Medal of Honor. You see the four listed here. With the exception of Benjamin Levy, I will point out that the other three are relatively recent immigrants to the United States, all Ashkenazi Jews. Leopold Karpelus had actually originally immigrated to Texas, but he was so offended by the institution of slavery, he moved from Texas to New York before the Civil War, and of course he would fight for the Union. The other thing that illustrates how important the presence of Jews in the Union forces became during the Civil War is the fact that four Jews became flag officers in the Union Army, in other words, generals. They were all breveted generals, which meant that they had the title of general. They were still paid at the colonel level. This is sort of a common thing that occurred during the Civil War. So we have four leaders that are appointed to the rank. One, who is the highest ranking, is Frederick C. Solomon, who is a breveted major general in the Union Army. He led the 9th Wisconsin Infantry and fought throughout Mississippi. The others are Brigadier Generals. Leopold Blumenberg is a general who fought at Antietam. General Knepfler fought at a wide range of battles, including Chickamauga. He's one of the leaders of the charge at Missionary Ridge. And as mentioned before, we have Edward Solomon, who fought valiantly both at the Battle of Gettysburg and at the Battle of Atlanta. Now, why did I become interested in Jews in the Civil War? My interest got piqued when one day I was working at the Museum of Civil War Medicine, a fine institution, who, remember, I hope you join after this presentation. And we had a group of bikers from West Virginia come to visit the museum, and I talked to them a little bit about it in one of the exhibit rooms. And the group moved on, except for one person who kind of stayed behind, and he kind of warily, came up to me, sidled up to me and said, "Pardon me, sir, I don't understand something." I go, "Well, what's that?" He goes, "Well, you're talking about how good medicine was during the Civil War." And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Well, I don't understand that because my father told me that they didn't allow Jews to be doctors during the Civil War. And he's also always told me that Jews are the only good doctors." I didn't know how, quite to answer that, but that's sort of what got me into the whole issue of, what role did the Jews play in the Civil War? So to answer his question, yeah, there indeed were a number of Jewish doctors in the Civil War and some pretty prominent ones. So there's this guy, Brevet Major Morris Joseph Ashe, who is the medical inspector for the Army of the Potomac. and would later become the staff surgeon for General Phil Sheridan from 1865 all the way to 1863. Then there's this guy, who I call the other Jewish Commodore. It's astonishing that the Navy, which is a relatively small service and a relatively tradition-bound service, had during the Civil War 2 Jewish Commodores. That's pretty incredible. This gentleman is Phineas Jonathan Hovitz, and he had joined the Navy in 1847. He's a lot different than, Commodore Levy. And again, he's part of that discussion I videoed back in April. So again, if you want to learn more about him, you can view that. But he is kind of the fair-haired boy of the Navy. He doesn't really experience any anti-Semitism at all. And in fact, he rises rapidly up the ranks. He will become the chief of the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery in 1865, just before the end of the war. And he will do a remarkable job in building the statistical base of that institution. By that time, the Army Museum of Medicine had done an extraordinary job in becoming a very sort of modern research institution. He helped the Navy's, institution sort of rise to that same level when he was head of it. Another remarkable Jewish surgeon is Jacob Mendez da Costa. He is a noted surgeon during the Civil War, but toward the end of the Civil War and afterwards, he'll become one of the pioneers of looking into the mental effects and damages of war on veterans, what today we might call post-traumatic stress disorder. He looked at that phenomenon and started investigating ways of diagnosing it and dealing with it. He termed the problems as irritable heart syndrome, but he's an important pioneer in that field. The other thing he's sort of noted for is when former President Grant starts to have mouth pain, which will later be diagnosed as, he first consults da Costa. Da Costa looks at it and says, you really need to see someone and you need to do it very quickly. Unfortunately, Grant did not heed his advice, waited too long. But anyway, remarkable pioneer in the field of medicine. Now, the other institution where Jews come to the fore during the Civil War is the chaplaincy. Up until the Civil War, the United States government required that chaplains had to be of a Christian denomination, ordained in a Christian denomination. When the war starts, the Confederates say, basically any clergyman can be a chaplain. But throughout the course of the war, they never designate any Jewish chaplains. In the Union Army in 1861, there is an attempt by one regiment to appoint a chaplain who is Jewish, but he's not a rabbi, and the YMCA objects, saying he is not of a Christian denomination. So in 1862, both Congress and Lincoln make a determined effort, a successful effort, to change the law. And basically it says you can be a chaplain if you're an ordained minister of any denomination. So with that change, Lincoln appoints Rabbi Jacob Frankel as the first Jewish hospital chaplain in US history. He will go on to appoint another rabbi as a chaplain as well. Now, the other way you get to be a chaplain is if you are appointed by a regimental commander to be one, and that happens with the New York 54th Regiment. They also bring on a chaplain. So this is a very important step in institutionalizing Judaism as part of, American culture. Now, do Jews experience anti-Semitism during the Civil War? Yeah, despite all these remarkable gains, it's fairly prevalent, and it's prevalent on both sides. And some leading publications of the time published really vicious, anti-Semitic cartoons and articles. This one that you see here is from Vanity Fair, and it basically has the Union recruiting sergeant going up to this Jew who has a rather prominent nose and, kind of stereotypical features, and says, hey, do you want to be a patriot and join the army? And the Jew replies, no, I'd rather make, sell clothes to the army and make no profit. It's kind of like a sarcastic remark. One of the terms that's used often in the Civil War that sort of becomes synonymous with Jews is the term shoddy. Shoddy is a term that's used for wool that has no structural value to it, and it's often pawned off in uniforms. You can make enormous profit off of it, and people assume that this is something that's done primarily by Jewish merchants. Did Jewish merchants do it? Yeah, some did, but plenty of non-Jewish merchants did it as well. And the other thing that happens throughout the war is cotton speculation. Cotton becomes a very valuable commodity because of the Union blockade. If you can get your hands on some cotton and get it across into the north or to Europe, you can make a fortune. And again, is that something that Jews are involved with? Well, as we'll talk about later, yes, some Jews were involved with it, but plenty of non-Jews were as well. There's no evidence to indicate that Jews were involved in war profiteering or cotton speculation any more than anyone else. There's also scapegoating of Judah Benjamin was kind of a target on both sides. Anti-Semites in the North would say, well, look at Judah Benjamin. He's a senior official in the South. That just shows you can't rely on the patriotism of any Jew. And then Southerners who are anti-Semites, particularly when he was Secretary of War, whenever they had a setback, would say, well, it's probably because you can't trust, Judah Benjamin because somehow he's betraying us. That's one of the reasons why Jefferson Davis appointed him as Secretary of State, because he was getting so much flack as Secretary of War. And then the other charge that was leveled at Jews was that they didn't fight. They didn't do their bit. And one of the ironic sources of this kind of slander came from an article that Mark Twain wrote for Century Magazine after the war. And he didn't do it trying to be anti-Semitic. He actually thought that the article was sort of pro-Jewish. And in it, he wrote something to the effect, well, yeah, Jews are patriotic, but they're not much on, seeing combat or joining armed forces. He got a lot of heat for that, and he recanted that. What was kind of ironic about it is that, Mark Twain was probably the last person that should have said that, because he's renowned for sort of leaving the Confederate Army before he had to go into his first battle. So, yeah, there's a lot of anti-Semitism that Jews have to deal with. But the main anti-Semitic issue of the war comes in December of 1862, when Ulysses S. Grant, who is embarking on his Vicksburg campaign, orders the infamous General Order Number 11, which to this day is the only official anti-Semitic act ever taken by the United States government. And basically, he orders the exile of all Jews from the area under his command. It's an enormous territory, as we'll discuss. This is the order in its entirety, but what I want you to look at in particular is the third aspect of the order, because I think that's the key to why it was issued and what it was all about. So what is the order's impact? Well, basically, it theoretically would exile Jews all the way from northern Mississippi to Cairo, Illinois. It's kind of a weird order. Grant is usually very specific, very targeted in his messages. This is an instance where he's uncharacteristically not very targeted. What makes the order more confusing is that there are Confederate cavalry raids, one by Nathan Bedford Forrest, which destroy telegraph wires. So a lot of areas under his command don't even get the order. And then the other aspect to it is, well, how does it affect Union Jewish soldiers that are under his command? And this is more than a theoretical problem, it's an actual one, because there's some notable Jewish commanders, one of whom is Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Spiegel of the Ohio 120th Regiment, which is on its way to join Grant's forces. This commander will later become a full colonel and is destined to become a brigadier general. They're putting in the paperwork for it. But unfortunately, he dies in the Red River in Louisiana in 1864. But what's remarkable about this is Marcus Spiegel comes to Vicksburg and he doesn't even know the order took place. So it's a very confusing order. Why does Grant issue it? Well, on the surface, you could say, again, it has to do with, cotton speculation, people trying to get cotton and, the belief that somehow Jewish merchants do this more than others. So, Grant wants to protect his army from, having to deal with cotton speculators. So he's going to ban Jews who are synonymous with all cotton speculation. The question is, though, really, why is he specifying Jews? Because Grant's not known to be anti-Semitic before the war, and as we'll talk about later, certainly not after the war. So why in this order is he specifically targeting Jews? Well, the answer is, and the answer was found by a remarkable scholar, Jonathan Sarnar. And if you want to know about Jews in the Civil War, I recommend you read his books. He's done numerous books. He's a great scholar. And he, after very careful research, determined that this order had more to do with family dynamics than with anti-Semitism. What had happened is Jesse Grant, Grant's father, who had a very strained relationship with Grant. Grant was a very honest man. His father was kind of a shady character. He was a good businessman, but he was always trying to cut corners. And what he had done is he had entered into a partnership with a prominent Jewish trading family in Cincinnati, the Mack family. They were very prominent, not known to be very scrupulous. And he concocted this plan with he and Henry Mack would come down to Vicksburg and convince General Grant to give them special permission to speculate in cotton. Well, Grant finds out about this and he's furious, he's livid, he freaks out, and he's in a position where he can't really issue an order against his father. He would find that too embarrassing. So in his haste and his anger, he sends out this terrible order that instead targets Jews. He later would confess that he instantly regretted it the moment he sent it. So what happens with the order? Well, again, there's a lot of confusion. A lot of localities, it never goes into effect. There are a few areas where it does go into effect. And one of the more prominent areas is Paducah, Kentucky. And the citizenry, the Jewish community decides to, resist the order. They go to congressional representatives and an audience is arranged with their delegation and President Lincoln at the White House. Lincoln was not aware of the order. As soon as he hears about it, he immediately countermands it. And as you can see his quote, "To condemn a class is to say the least, to wrong the good with the bad. I do not like to hear of a class or nationality condemned on account of a few sinners." The order is immediately sent to Grant, who again immediately countermands his order. So what's the impact of it? Well, for the Jews, particularly in the North, it galvanizes them as never before. It shows that they have political clout and they can exercise it if need be. For Grant, it has no immediate impact. There are a number of Democratic representatives that call for a scalp, but Lincoln is not going to do anything against Grant at this point. He's one of the, the most successful Union commanders. So he and Grant sort of sweep it under the rug. What are the long-term consequences for Grant, though? Well, it's interesting. After Grant becomes president of the United States, he becomes an extraordinary champion of the Jewish people. After he becomes president, he apologizes for the order. During his presidency, he appoints more Jews to public office than ever before. And by that, I mean not more than any other president. He appoints more Jews than all the other presidents before him combined. He seeks to appoint the first Jewish cabinet officer. It doesn't work out. He takes the unprecedented step. This is before, America is really perceived as a global power and gets involved in other nations' problems. But he takes the unprecedented step of trying to prevent the persecution of Jews in Russia and Romania. He appoints a Jew to be a special counsel to Romania. He will also successfully oppose legislation to declare America a Christian nation. And he'll take a number of unusual steps personally to show just how supportive he is of the Jewish community. He sits through a 4-hour ceremony for the dedication of a Jewish temple in Washington, D.C. And then he gives a very sizable contribution to that, congregation. So any free way possible, both officially and personally, he is a real champion of the Jewish people. And he's very responsible for opening up a whole new era for Jews in the United States, of tolerance, of acceptance. So he's a very virtuous man. Now, I'm going to sort of end this presentation. I began it with talking about the prominence of certain, Sephardic Jews and how their influence is very prominent, particularly in the South. Now, we're going to the end of the Jewish experience in the Civil War. And I'm going to focus on a different segment of the Jewish community and a different representative of that kind of new emerging Jewish community that's coming out of the Civil War. It's this man, Joseph Pulitzer. He is not from a well-born family. He is not an upper-class person. He instead is a rather lowly immigrant from Austria-Hungary, who comes over to enlist in the Union Army. And he does. He serves in the cavalry. And when the war is over, he moves to St. Louis and becomes a very successful newspaper publisher. And ironically, by the way, he marries a distant relative of Jefferson Davis. And he will go on to become one of the most influential forces in American culture when his newspaper empire takes off in New York. Among his accomplishments is he is a crucial player in the funding of the Statue of Liberty. In the 1890s, he, along with William Randolph Hearst, propelled the United States into the Spanish-American War, which leads the US to become a major player in global power. And finally, he is one of the founders of modern American journalism. He enshrines it through the Pulitzer Prize and other institutions that he establishes. So looking at the entire Jewish experience, both during and after the war, yeah, I think these are the highlights. The Civil War really assimilates large segments of the U.S. Jewish population into the American mainstream as never before. Jewish rights are established in more American institutions, like the chaplaincy that we talked about. The general American population, particularly in the North, is having more and more interactions with Jews. And at the same time, as I mentioned, particularly in the North, there's a stronger sense of identity and unity within the Jewish American community. And overall, the Ashkenazi influence will gain over the Sephardic influence in the Jewish community nationwide. And the Civil War and its aftermath really set the stage for Jews to play a more integrated, vital role in the shaping of all American culture. So that's my presentation, and I'll be very happy to take any questions. I will put up on the screen some of these sources that I encourage you to look at if you're interested in the story of Jews in the Civil War. And again, I'll be happy to take any questions. If we have extra time, there's one little bonus thing I'll talk about, but John, I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brad. And I don't know if you can hear that right now, but that's the sound of many people applauding in various places across the United States in front of their computer.
Okay, well, that's very nice to hear.
Yeah, we got a lot of great questions in the comments. Let me see here. Well, first of all, we have a question we have many questions from Nils. And saying some devout Jews who took the southern position cited passages from the Old Testament in defense of slavery, but the conditions in slavery permitted in the Torah were entirely different from chattel slavery in the United States. How do you think observant Jews reconciled this contradiction? Would you say that they ignored it altogether or didn't see it as a contradiction at all?
Well, that's a good question. And again, here you have a difference of opinion. You know, Rabbi Rappel said, well, it's sanctioned by the Bible, and so it must be okay, basically. He says, it's in the Bible, it's good. Other, very devout Jews, including, other rabbis say, well, first of all, as Nils pointed out, the slavery they're talking about in the Bible is entirely different than the slavery that's occurring in the American South. And then others took a broader view and said, look, we as Jews have to go beyond what's literally in the Bible to look at the spirit of the Bible. And if you take the Bible in its entirety and you look at the story of Exodus, there is no way as a Jew that you can in any way sanction slavery, particularly the type of slavery that's going down south. So yeah, I mean, it is an issue that, like many religious issues, people can go to the Bible and come up with entirely different interpretations of what the Bible says.
Yeah, I loved your how you kind of broke that down and kind of introduced the complexity there into, what you said at the beginning has often been painted as a pretty simple narrative.
Yeah, the one thing I should point out is that when you read memoirs of Jewish soldiers, Northern Jewish soldiers, you see that a lot of them who before the war may have not thought much about abolition or been kind of on the fence, when they start to go down south and they start to see the conditions that the slaves lived in, many of them do become more and more fervent abolitionists. And I think that's a tendency in the Northern Army in general. The more Northern soldiers and sailors came into contact and seeing what the actual conditions were for slaves, more and more of them were very comfortable with the direction that Abraham Lincoln was taking the war in terms of emancipation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, nothing like being confronted with something like that to change your mind.
Right.
Question from Robert Smith, one of our longtime viewers here. He says, in regards to Shaco Hill Cemetery and others, were Jewish soldiers buried separately from other soldiers?
Normally, in terms of like in a segregationist way, no. I think it was something that Jewish community members often liked the idea of having, a separate cemetery. I think that was more of a practice down south because you have more established families down there. If there was separation on battlefields or anything run by the government, either government, I'm not aware of it. It may have happened, but I'm just not. I think, again, separate burial grounds for Jews was sort of a voluntary thing and something that was often promoted by Jewish communities to highlight the sacrifice they made in the war.
Another question from V. Hansen. New York's Garibaldi Guard had 2 Jewish companies. Was this for reasons of food or chaplains or something else entirely? And I don't want to step on your toes, but my guess would be that there were 2 specifically Jewish companies because they enlisted because they wanted to kind of form that bond. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't honestly know the answer to that. Again, Jewish units often, joined up and would combine with other existing units. As I mentioned before, they very often bonded with, German American units because they had kind of that solidarity. I don't know specifically about those 2 Garibaldi units, but again, if you were a member of the, Jewish community in New York and that's sort of what was happening, that's what you would, very often align yourself with.
Great comment from Carolyn Ivanoff, friend of the museum, and ever the wealth of knowledge about Civil War Connecticut history. She added another Jewish surgeon that she's aware of, Nathan Meyer, surgeon for the 11th and 16th Connecticut. So thanks for sending that along, Carolyn.
Yeah, there is also another surgeon that I left out of the presentation. He's actually the Surgeon General of the Confederacy. His name is David Cameron de Leon. The reason why I don't put him in the presentation, he didn't really have that much of an illustrious career as Surgeon General. He only lasted a month in that position because he had a horrible drinking problem. So he's not, one of the highlights of the Jewish experience in the Civil War, but I will mention him.
Yes, Judy asked, did Judah Benjamin's wife have a priest say the last rites over him against his objections as he lay on his deathbed? Do you know anything about that, Brad?
Yeah, I'm using in this presentation a very loose definition of Jews. It's the Victorian definition of Jews, which is if you were born Jewish, have Jewish heritage, you were sort of considered a Jew. So some of these people, like Judah Benjamin, was by no means a practicing Jew. His wife was a Catholic. I think they may have been married in a Catholic ceremony. My strong hunch, I'm not an expert on Judah Benjamin, but I'm sure if he had his last rites performed by a priest, he wouldn't really have objected too much about it. That's in stark contrast to Uriah Levy, who is a very devout Jew, and gives a lot to Jewish charities and that sort of thing. Interesting fact about Uriah Levy, he's a devout Jew, but he uses part of his fortune to buy a lot of religious tracts and Bibles to take with him on his missions abroad. None of these materials are Jewish, they're all Christian. And the reason why is he believed, as he would say, that the religion of Christ was the greatest civilizing force in the world. So ironically, a devout Jew proselytizes for Christianity around the world.
Fascinating.
He's an interesting guy.
No doubt about that. And then finally, another question from Nils. Why do you think Clement Vallandigham and George Pendleton, two prominent Copperhead Democrats, condemned official acts of anti-Semitism by the Union military, but showed no qualms about using racism against African Americans? Do you think it was a convenient way of attacking the Lincoln administration rather than out of any particular sympathy for Jews?
I think in large part it's a way of attacking the Lincoln administration and possibly garnering support among Jews. I mean, there were Jewish communities that potentially could, maybe affect the outcome of certain local elections, that sort of thing. One of the questions in Grant's first bid for the presidency was, would the Jewish vote come out heavily against him in the election of 1868? There's really no indication that they did. And certainly by the time of his reelection, after all the things he had done for the Jewish community, there really wasn't any sense that they would come out against him. But no, I think during the war, Democrats and Copperheads were that faction of the party were looking for anything they could use against the Lincoln administration that was embarrassing and divisive.
So we're just a little bit over time. We've gone through many of the questions in the comments. Even though we're a little bit over time, you teased us, Brad, with a little postscript. So why don't you give that to us?
Okay, this is quick. This guy is remarkable. His name is Lewis Morrison, otherwise known as Morris W. Morrison. And boy, he was one of a kind. He is a Jewish black person who sells in this country from Jamaica. At the outbreak of the war, he enlists as an officer in the 1st Louisiana Native Guard, which is a Confederate Home Guard unit. So he's a black Jewish Confederate officer. After the occupation of New Orleans, he then enlists in the Union Army Regiment that will later become the 73rd Regiment Infantry U.S. Colored Troops. So he is a black Jewish Union officer. And then later on, he will become a very famous stage actor, and he will start an acting dynasty. And indeed, 2 of his grandchildren, Joan and Constance Bennett, will become the leading actresses of their time in movies during the 1930s and 40s. So this guy is not only the first black Jewish Confederate officer, he's also the first black Jewish Union officer. Again, kind of a one-in-a-kind character.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I'd be curious to hear a presentation about it, his entire life. Sounds like you said, fascinating guy.
I think that would take another hour, but I just wanted to let people know about his unusual case, shall we say.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Brad. We really appreciate you doing this, and we appreciate you out there tuning in on this Monday, Labor Day afternoon. If you enjoyed the video, please like the video and share it. And if you can, it would really help us out if you became a member at the Museum of Civil War Medicine. So with all that said, this is John and Brad signing off, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.